Hello, and welcome to the very first interview in a series of conversations that we're doing with venue management industry leaders and experts from around the globe. My name is Gary Dalton, and I'm the CMO of Venue Pro, which is a venue and event management technology platform. And we essentially help venue and event operators streamline their operations and drive automation, as well as productivity. Venue Pro is used currently by around 50 stadiums, arenas, and convention centres worldwide, including the likes of Wembley Stadium, Oakview Group, and Singapore Sports Hub, to name a few. And I'm delighted to say we have James DeMeo joining us today, who I think it's fair to say is a world-leading expert when it comes to sports security and is also a highly respected voice worldwide. So we're very lucky to have him on this first call. And James, thanks so much for joining us today. Just to kick off, would you be able to provide a bit of an overview of your background, experience, expertise, and what you're currently doing for our audience?
Sure. Gary, thank you so much for the opportunity to have a timely conversation about today's sports security industry. Good morning, everyone. My name is James DeMeo. I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina. 3.5 decades in security, 21 of which I was in law enforcement with the Nassau County Police Department on Long Island, New York, retired detective. I earned a postgraduate degree from Adelphi University in Garden City, New York. Subsequently, I opened the Barclays Center with AEG in 2012, which was an amazing experience in Brooklyn, New York. I spent about a year working at a mid-sized venue in Central Texas, the Cedar Park Center. And since then, I've been focusing on risk assessments, higher education. I'm teaching on both the graduate and undergraduate levels this semester, of the past year, obviously, with just all the challenges that we're seeing. But Gary, thank you for the opportunity to really discuss, the numerous challenges that are facing today's sports security industry.
That's great. Thanks, James. So we've got a fair few questions to get through, so we'll dive straight into it. We'll be splitting this conversation up into two parts. So this is part one, obviously, and we'll share part two across our social media channels as well as this part. In this first part, we'll be touching on crowd management, communications, cybersecurity, and emergency planning. So for the first question for you, James, why do you think crowd management is so important for today's venue security leaders, and why should they take it so seriously?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gary. Certainly, everyone is concerned about crowd management. When you're dealing with large groups of people in densely populated areas, obviously there are emerging risks domestically and internationally. Certainly, the tragedy coming out of Astra, the Travis Scott concert, and so when we manage enterprise security risk management for sports security, we have to look at risks not only from inside the command center, but also during the ingress screening, as well as those entertainment zones, which are considered soft targets. They're prime targets for terrorist strikes on exterior perimeters, again, that flow into entertainment zones. So crowd management is a daily conversation that I'm having with folks like yourself, folks throughout the industry. This is the information that I'm sharing with the future leaders in higher education in terms of workforce development. When my students go out into these spaces, they have to understand crowd dynamics and density and crowd management. Obviously the crowd manager is the 1 to 250 rule. For every 250 patrons, you should have one highly trained security professional. Gary, what's your definition of a highly trained security professional? Is it James and Gary, or is it someone who's very new to sports security that may not understand some of the things that we'll be talking about during this discussion? So crowd management is something that's on everyone's mind. No venue wants to actually end up in court 6 months down the road not being proactive in terms of managing crowds within these spaces. So it's definitely a topic of discussion for today's sports venue risk managers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess from a kind of fan perspective, the key for me would be how do we ensure a secure environment at the venues that we visit and love, but without kind of making the venue feel like a police state, still ensuring we have an amazing fan experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. When I helped open Barclays, we work with guest services. They high five the patrons on the way out. So it's creating that harmonious relationship with the well-paying fans. Fast forward to 2025, we're seeing what's happening in the world, domestically, internationally. Protesting, civil unrest, geopolitical divisiveness. Fans can choose to spend their disposable income any way they want. And if they don't have an amazing game day experience, quite honestly, quite frankly, they're going to take that experience somewhere else. So what can the venues do to, again, create obviously harmonious working relationship with the fans? And I always talk about just, treating customers and patrons with dignity and respect. And that gets into the verbal de-escalation piece. But when we look at today's sports and entertainment industry, it's a multi-billion-dollar juggernaut. So we're looking at NIL, we're looking at venue naming rights. The Barclays Center received $250 million over 20 years for the venue naming rights. So all that is wonderful in the sport marketing piece. But if something tragically happens and there's a security breach or some kind of adverse security situation, now that venue is known as that venue for all the wrong reasons. And we certainly don't want to have that. So I think when we get out in front of these challenges, when we educate, when we do risk assessments, when we obviously integrate technologies, we place that venue in a position, that venue ownership group in a position of strength to not be known as that venue.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. You mentioned verbal de-escalation there as well, and so thinking about kind of the guest services staff, how important is the verbal de-escalation, training the skills, and how do you think it can help in handling kind of conflicts at the venue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's tremendously important to treat fans with dignity and respect during the ingress. 8 out of 10 times, 80% of the time, if you can verbally de-escalate through, just commands where you can actually bring the person down if they're having a bad day, that can place the guest services staff in a position of strength. Obviously, we look at effective alcohol beverage control programs. So sometimes you are dealing with intoxicated fans, which makes it a little bit more challenging, but we can turn that guest services staff into security. We can teach them about verbal de-escalation. We can teach them about situational awareness. It can become a multi-pronged approach for that point of contact for the fans when they come through ingress. That's security, guest services, contracted security, and law enforcement. All those folks that work that point of contact with the well-paying fan on the ingress. It's so important that everyone establishes eye contact, treats people with dignity and respect. But the verbal de-escalation piece is really huge in those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great. And you kind of, again, touching on the communication side of things and coordination between different departments and external bodies, how can security teams at the venue improve the real-time communication with external bodies and internally, and also coordinate that during a crisis situation?
Yeah, I mean, another great question. So coordination of efforts with those key stakeholders during the ingress, but certainly from the inside out, outside in. Obviously, you just ensuring that everybody's on the same page in the interest of public safety, understanding the language that's spoken in, today's sports security industry, but just, policies, procedures, protocols. We'll get into some of the practicing pieces of it, but just understanding what everybody's role is, and everybody's a leader in those spaces, whether you're guest services, security, law enforcement, the vendors, everyone, has an entrusted duty of care with inside that space to let somebody in a position of authority know that something's not right. But communications, and certainly crisis communications, it's important in terms of building trust and transparency with the well-paying fans.
Yeah, absolutely. And how does the social media side of things? Obviously, social media's become, part of everyone's lives, been prevalent everywhere. It's omnipresent now on people's phones and computers for the last 15 years or so, and it's only going to get bigger and have more impact. So how does sort of social media monitoring and using social media positively play a role in helping to identify and address potential threats at live
Yeah,
events?
yeah, certainly responsible social media monitoring inside the command center by law enforcement, what's being posted in real time across all social media platforms, hashtag bomb, hashtag active shooter. These are things that law enforcement can responsibly monitor across all social media platforms. And we have to be mindful that it's a seamless, touchless experience. Fans can download their tickets, they go in, they go through screening. But again, we've seen in the Super Bowl, and Kathy Lanier does a wonderful job with all the resources she has, but invariably a fan gets on the field. And what happens is if the networks cut away from that, you have 80,000 fans that can use their smartphones to record that incident, post it on social media, and now it becomes potentially, an unsafe event. So, Certainly responsible social media monitoring falls under, obviously just business continuity and crisis communications. But what's law enforcement doing to monitor and obviously, in my law enforcement experience, everything was the real thing until proven otherwise. So if law enforcement can obviously properly vet these potential threats pre, during, and post event, it places that venue ownership group in a position of strength to best deal with those types of challenges.
Yeah, great. And then in talking about kind of challenges as well, obviously cybersecurity, a growing issue for all organizations, companies, governments around the world. How do venue owners, venue operators, how do they kind of manage those cyber threats, whether it's on their kind of day-to-day systems like ticketing systems, like their Wi-Fi? Obviously, fan data is open to these types of attacks as well. So, what systems or processes or procedures can venue owners put in place to protect them from these types of cyber threats?
Yeah, I mean, the chief technology officers inside these multi-billion-dollar venues want their 15 seconds or 15 minutes of fame, to get in front of the CEOs and talk about some of the challenges that you just, obviously outlined in your question. But yeah, I mean, we're talking about sensitive proprietary information from the well-paying fans. It goes to a third party, could end up on the dark web. We're talking about players and vendors' contract information getting into the wrong hands. So nefarious bad actors can infiltrate the cyber mainframes, whether it's Wi-Fi, whether it's, the critical infrastructure piece we saw in the Superdome a couple of years ago, the lights went out. Thankfully, it wasn't cyber terrorism. It was a bad energy feed. But yeah, the bad actors are looking at those playbooks to see what could we do to obviously get into the mainframes, to turn the lights off, to gain control of the CC television and the access control, and obviously gain access to the sensitive proprietary information that's being stored from the well-paying fans, as I said, as they enter these spaces.
Okay. And obviously that's been a threat. Cyber threats have been around for, again, probably, 15 years now. So what about looking ahead a bit? What about emerging technologies that are kind of coming through now or available at the moment, or you see being available in the future that will enhance security in sports venues? And how do you think they will contribute to improving the security ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, it is an ecosystem. So ASIS International talks about convergence, Gary. That's the integration of physical security and cybersecurity technologies, but certainly things like, biometrics and iris scans and ingress screening, magnetometers, hand wanding, geofencing, as I mentioned earlier, the responsible social media monitoring, as well as the license plate reader technology that law enforcement can use in exterior parking lots. These are all technologies that are integrated to help, create the amazing game day experience, but also keep fans safe. So we have to, obviously, there's a lot, it can be information overload for potential clients because there's a lot of bells and whistles out there. But I really do see we can't get away from the human element of the guard or the officer letting their guard down, so to speak. But at the same time, if we can give them the technologies to be proficient in what they do, to look at the space holistically, ASAS talks about enterprise security risk management. It's concentric circles of security. So it's inside the command center, it's CC television, access control. As I mentioned, the geofencing piece, incident, severe and inclement weather monitoring, having a meteorologist full-time on staff during the Super Bowl as an example to monitor what's going on with weather patterns. These are technologies that are being integrated. Incident tracking is important. Vendor management. These are things that can be timestamped so that if a fan slips in section 101, and now it becomes obviously a liability situation that can be tracked. It can be documented. It could be backdate, back to when the incident took occur. Again, to place the organization in the best position possible that their actions were reasonable and necessary, and they did the best they could to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, and that's interesting because incident management is a key module within Venue Pro, and it does exactly that. It provides a digitized version of an event in real time that you can then go back and you can audit and you can provide information to the relevant stakeholders. The other thing that Venue Pro does well as well is pre-event planning. So the whole PEEPs piece. So and again, that's obviously crucial in terms of security measures and making sure that whenever you're running an event, you do all your pre-event planning and your pre-event checks. How do you kind of see that working at the moment in venues, and how better could sporting events manage those pre-event planning checks?
There's always room for improvement. No one bats 1,000% in the sports security industry, but you're absolutely on point with that. The pre-event meetings are crucial. The walkthroughs, what you do in practice, that muscle memory that I learned in law enforcement, but what you do in practice is how you're going to react during a true crisis situation. So is the venue not only doing the risk assessments, which are paramount, but also reviewing policies, procedures, protocols? Are they doing red teams? Are they doing simulations and tabletops? What is their crisis communications policy? What is their insider threat policy, workplace violence? These are things that are really important that they should be reviewing, obviously, as often as possible, but certainly looking at it holistically. What we do in practice is how we're going to react. Are they evacuating? Are they sheltering in place? These are things, that they should be having in a timely manner because, again, they want to get out in front of potential challenges. And certainly I'm a big fan of, pre-event meetings as well. What went wrong, what went right. Let's look at the after action report as an example. Las Vegas shooting incident, what went wrong, what went right, and what were the lessons learned moving forward? So we're not known as that venue if something tragically happens, moving forward.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned kind of emergency evacuation drills, simulations, red team exercises. How often should those types of activities be done? Who should be involved? And what should be the kind of the mainstream approach in that regard?
Well, certainly the risk assessments, in my professional opinion, should be done at a minimum one time a year. The evacuations, the tabletops, all the key stakeholders, Gary should wear the emergency manager's hat and James should wear the crisis communications hat. And we should obviously change hats in that simulation so that if someone is not there, someone else who's already I understand your role and vice versa. But we have leaders that are cross-functionally trained to understand how to lead people to safety during true crisis, situations. So those tabletops are critical in terms of, and again, we get into the technology integrations with crowd management and density and crowd surges and crowd crushes. But when we practice these things, when we utilize technology, obviously to get out in front, it places us again in a position of strength to best mitigate these types of challenges.
Yeah. That's great. And then finally for this part, in terms of preparing for a security breach on an event day, what contingencies would you say should be in place to mitigate those types of breaches?
Well, again, the risk assessment, as I've mentioned, the concentric circles, obviously what's going on in the command center, utilizing the technologies, looking at your ingress screening, fan codes of conduct, obviously clear bag policies, but utilizing the venue website to educate the fans before they come out and looking at those soft target exterior perimeters just outside ingress that flow into mass transit hubs. We saw with the obviously NBA, the Milwaukee Bucks had a shooting at the watch party. So these are sport marketing and marketing pieces, but again, no venue wants to be known as having a softer target just outside of the ingress screening. So certainly, obviously the risk assessments, the crisis communications, the business continuity, a little bit of the supply chain, as far as maybe any food tampering and contamination, properly vetting, obviously, the vendors, who's getting in, the credentialing piece, understanding that people have, certain people only have restricted access to sensitive areas. Who are those people? Ensuring that they're properly credentialed. So it's really an inside out, outside, holistic approach to safeguarding these spaces.
Amazing. Well, thanks, James. That's kind of it for part one. So we'll wrap it up there. But I think a really, really useful, kind of insightful first 20 minutes or so. So thanks for joining us today. We hope
Yeah.
you enjoyed this first part. Please do look out for part two in the Venue Pro social media feeds, and we'll be seeing you again soon.